And this is very interesting and very topical, and I think very important for many, many organizations. We've introduced a new cost planning capability, which goes along with the ability to do margin analysis. That's both to keep your regular costing more accurate, but also to simulate what could be sudden changes in your costs, for example, with tariffs. So that's a very topical thing nowadays. So let me kind of take you through that. So and I won't go through this in great detail because this is like a basic setup of what cost accounting is, but the idea here is that you collect costs you collect costs of various types that you then allocate to your the different things that go on in your manufacturing process. So you buy materials, you have overheads associated with those materials, like the tariffs or the taxes that you pay. You have resources, which would be people or machines, and then you have overheads like the electricity that goes into the machine, and then you have general overheads like the insurance policy on the factory. And you have rules that allocate all of those down to the different things that are bought or made in that operation. And so what happens is that once you get costs determined at sort of for every component and everything you buy and all the components, all the work that goes on in the factory, we then roll those up based on how many of those components are used in each of the final products or finished goods that you make. You can find out where all those components are used, how many of them are used, and you get a roll up of product costs, which you call cost of goods manufactured. And that's your basic set of costs that are in the system. Then if you pair that with some demand, which could be your historical demand, like how many of each of those you sold last year, or it could be your open order book, how many of those are you on course to sell that you already know people contracted for, or it could be a demand forecast of how much you expect to sell over the next year or whatever period. And with that, you bring those things together and you get a projection of your product margins. So knowing how many of each thing I'm going to sell and knowing what the cost of that is, I can figure out the margin contribution of each of those products and then aggregate that up to my overall business. So how do you use this in practice? So what we've given you is an ability to take all of these costs that you're accumulating in general ledger and in procurement and bring them in and create a cost plan based on allocation rules. And then if you compare that to the standard costs you're currently operating with, you can say, okay, are the variances, like the ways that cost plan differs, do those reflect conditions that are likely to continue? So if my insurance costs went up, that's probably something that's going to continue. And if my old standard costs they reflect like a lower insurance rate, and now I have a higher insurance rate, I should probably accept the results of that plan and update my standard costs to reflect this new ongoing reality of my business situation. There also may be cases where something occurred that was an extraordinary event, and the costs associated with that aren't really recurring, and maybe it doesn't make sense to update your standard costs. So the idea is that periodically, however you makes sense for you to do it in your business, you would update your costs based on these cost plans. You'd update your costs to be more accurate standard costs. You just basically perfect your standard costs with the model of continuous improvement. So that's kind of the basic idea of why we have this. You also can use it in the new product introduction case, where if you're making, let's say, a new model of your phone that you're selling, some of the components in it, their costs are well established because they were in your prior model, but maybe there's some new component like a new camera that you weren't in your prior model, so you don't have a cost history of that. So you make some estimates about what that's going to be, and then as you start producing and you start accumulating the real information about like the number of resources it took to make me buy this and put it in and test it and whatever else is involved, you may figure out that those estimates aren't exactly right, and then you go into this continuous improvement mode to perfect those estimates. So it's useful in that context. But the one I want to really focus on today is you can use that same mechanism for ad hoc cost simulation. So you can create a cost plan that's not just based on getting your latest actual accounting information and updating the costs. You can actually model like what if the cost was going to change, what would happen. So a scenario here to consider is what if you wanted to think about whether because of the tariff policy that either is in effect or might go into effect, your something that cost you $4 has now got some component that you use throughout all your products. Rather, it used to cost you $4, now it's going to cost you $8. And you may have a whole variety of changes like this, and you want to model out, say, what would that tariff situation do to my margins? So we give you an interface here where you can bring up all the items in the bill of materials and put in a simulated cost. And then what we do is we run that where used analysis, so that how many of those components are in each assembly, how many of the assemblies go into the finished products, all of that, to come up with a new simulated extended cost, or a new simulated cost for the final product that you're going to potentially sell. And how that compares to the current item cost. You can see how this cost will impact your products. Now, you could then apply this some demand and say, okay, if I have a certain amount of demand for all of my products, what will this new scenario do to my model, do to my margins, right? So that I have current actuals that my